Can you give me a quick historical background of immigration in America and intolerance and the campaigns pushed against the other, and how we're seeing it very similarly in the Trump campaign and the other intolerant rhetoric that's being put out there?
Sure. Of course, this country has been diverse from the very beginning. It had people of different ethnicities coming here. All of the British and the Germans were the first Europeans to really come in large numbers. And then right away, I mean, there were Dutch people here, there were other nationalities, and native people, of course, were already here, and the African-American slaves that were brought here. So the U.S., unlike the popular wisdom, was a fairly diverse country from the beginning. It became more diverse as the second wave of immigrants came in the 1800s, the Irish, for example, the Italians, the Eastern Europeans. And they became factory workers. They were brought here as factory workers, semi-skilled workers, and they did okay. It took them a while to climb the ladder, and there was a class differentiation of the Americans who came here first, the Germans and English. They climbed the ladder first. They became the dominant group. And there was a lot of prejudice against the newcomers, even the Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans and the Irish, who were really folks with light skin like the British. The Irish were kept out of the society in so many ways. There were signs on restaurants that said Irish need not apply. And the English dominant people in that particular community looked at the Irish, looked down on them as being subhuman in many cases. You know, there was a terrible story of a bishop that was traveling to the countryside in Ireland a few hundred years ago. He had his driver, who was an English driver of the carriage. He noticed the Irish working in the potato fields, and he looked at them. The bishop looked at them and said to the driver, "This is very surprising. How is it that these Irish monkeys look so much like we do?" This was the attitude, that the Irish was subhuman. So this was carried over to the United States by some of these dominant elites. And of course, every time there was a wave of immigrants that came in, they were discriminated against and kept out of the system for a while and looked on with suspicion. And yet eventually they tended to assimilate and come in. They learned the English language, they learned the American ways, as the Italian Americans also integrated and assimilated rather. You saw that, the acceptance there. And the Irish themselves climbed the ladder through getting involved in politics, setting up the Democratic Party political machines, and they brought themselves up that way. The Italians and the Polish used the Catholic Church to institutionalize themselves and to be able to use that as an institution to raise themselves up. And the Italians used business. So this has happened constantly with the European immigrants. Of course, you have Latinos who were here as an immigrant minority and actually as native people. They were here in the part of the United States even before many of the white settlers came in, right? In Texas, for example, California, Colorado, they were all part of Mexico. Latinos lived there. The Mexican government allowed the American settlers to come from, the slaveholders, many of them, former slaveholders, come from Tennessee and settle in Texas, as long as the Americans agreed to give up slavery and to convert to Catholicism. Well, the Texas immigrants came in from Tennessee, rather, they did not comply with the Mexican law. So illegally, they kept their religion, they didn't take Catholicism, they brought slaves with them in many cases, and they were actually acting as illegal immigrants in Texas, which is Mexican territory. So with that kind of history and the Mexican-American War, which Henry David Thoreau and Abraham Lincoln felt was an unprovoked, unjust war to grab land, that war resulted in half of Mexican territory being taken by the U.S. and bought for very little money after being defeated in war. And so the people that were there were formerly were kind of occupied people in some ways, the Latinos, and this discrimination continued. You know, with the Bracero program in World War II to bring in guest workers, with all the discrimination going on. Professor Rodolfo Acuna has written a book called Occupied America, The Chicano Struggle Toward Liberation, in which he says that there's a model of internal colonialism in much of the barrios in the Southwest, in the inner cities where Mexican Americans have lived. They have been the working class poor who've helped make the outside businessmen rich because they get hired for very low wages. So that has to be changed. And then you have other groups that have been here, of course, that came in later on. The Asian Americans came quite early as well. The Chinese to build the railroads. The Japanese Americans were here already. Indian Americans came later on and did well economically. But every time much of these immigrants came in, they were ostracized and kept out by some of the nativists that still held over. For example, the Know Nothing Party. They were so suspicious of foreigners, they wanted to keep them out completely. Now, the latest manifestation is Donald Trump's statements about saying, he kicked off his campaign promising to build a huge wall to keep those illegal Mexicans out, as he put it. He said, these Mexicans coming here illegally, they are rapists and they are taking our jobs, and we're going to stop them and I'm going to deport them when I'm president. It was nothing more than a racist attitude to galvanize people to support him and to put him on the front lines of the Republican nomination. And he continues with that to this very day. and it's having a backlash, obviously.
Real quick on that. So this idea of they're taking our jobs, but a lot of people don't connect the idea of capitalism and it's a bottom dollar industry, right? Yeah. If you want to go get slave wages and pick strawberries for $6 an hour, no one's holding you back from that. That's right. If you want to hire an American and pay him what you think is a good wage, you're going to be paying $15 for a head of lettuce.
That's right.
So show me how that connects and how people view immigrants, especially the legals and illegal Mexicans working here who are really helping our economy and giving our things for pretty much slave labor because we want them cheap. Talk about that.
Absolutely. That has to do with big agribusiness wanting these cheap labor workers to pick lettuce and tomatoes and things so we can have the affordable salads and other things, and they can make more profit. Agribusiness makes profit off these undocumented workers, many of them, who themselves are still paying taxes because they buy products and they pay sales taxes. They pay other kinds of taxes. Their low wages actually is producing more productivity in the economy. And there's been a study done recently showing that the working poor in America actually may have lost about 1% of income to undocumented workers. Some of them may have taken jobs as dishwashers, etc. The middle class in America has lost nothing to undocumented workers, whereas the upper class, the corporate leaders, the big factory owners, the agribusiness owners, they have made huge profits off the undocumented workers, and their income actually went up because of that. And Donald Trump doesn't talk about that, and he doesn't talk about NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, which brought even more of this problem. It dumped American corn, agribusiness corn, from big companies like Cargill and Monsanto. They dumped their GMO corn on Mexico because of NAFTA allowing the free trade. It drove out the Mexican small family farmer, corn farmer, made him unemployed. He goes to the city to find work with General Motors, who's now located their factory there that pays next to nothing to the workers to build the cars. He can't afford to live with that and support his family or her family. And so some of them come eventually across the border and risk their lives coming here. Why aren't they talking about the macroeconomic problems there that free trade brings about undocumented workers? Trump doesn't want to touch that part of it because he's stirring up hatred. There's a certain type of neo-fascism and racism that Trump is using to scare the white, working class, unemployed worker who is usually a high school graduate, not much more than that, and who is feeling very resentful that his world is falling apart, mainly because of outsourcing of a lot of his work. But the manufacturing job that white American male worker who's 40 or 50 years old has lost is not the lettuce-picking job or the dishwashing job that the undocumented folks, some of them are doing. So this is not that complicated. If I can have 2 minutes on NBC News, I could explain it.
Yeah.
And the public would understand it better.
Yeah. Question is, do they want to?
No.
Next question, in terms of business as well, Donald Trump, the guy's bankrupted 4 businesses. He's not even a good businessman.
That's right.
It looks like, for me, half our country still wants it to go back to the 1950s, in a way.
Yeah. I don't think it's half.
More
maybe
or
30,
less?
No, maybe less.
Okay.
30%. You look at Trump's numbers. He has got about 40%. He's maxed out at 40% of the Republican vote. The Republican Party now is down to 26% of American voters. You know that? The Democrats are down to 30%. Republicans are 26%. Independents or declining states have risen to 43%. So you take Trump's numbers, 40% of 26%, and maybe a few independents. He doesn't have a whole lot of support. And in the general election, he's plateaued, in my view. I said that already on television. And he's plateaued. He's not going to be able to win the general election. So I would say that still the public has to be educated. Even many Trump supporters need to be educated on this. How do we do it? It has to be done with what you're doing with your videos, with your social media, out in the public. Because the corporate media does not seem to want to really do this. They're starting to look at Trump a little bit more skeptically. But the corporate media, they loved Trump all this time because he brought them ratings. There you go. And it was all about the bottom line again, wasn't it? Profit driven. And believe me, I'm not a Bible thumper, but there's some great words in the Bible and other scriptures.
Absolutely.
What does it profit a man if he should gain the whole world but lose his own soul? I would ask, what does it profit a nation if she should gain the whole world and lose her own soul? What is America's soul all about originally? It was about equality of opportunity. It was about human rights, natural rights, guaranteeing of it by government, but cannot be taken away by government because it's given to us by higher power or by the universe. Natural rights, right? And yet look at what Trump is doing about the idea of natural rights. He's stepping on it, basically. And we have to look at ourselves carefully in our own mirror to see what are we doing with our country, what are we losing, what part of our soul are we losing, and we need to fix that and get it back. That's what I would suggest. And it's very dangerous, it's very disheartening for some people in our way of thinking when we see people like Trump gaining all these followers. But we should not get disheartened, because those are a minority. They tend to be underinformed, uninformed, and some of them are just very angry and emotional now because of what's happened to them.
Right.
They've lost their jobs. They've lost their old America when they had a job in the 1950s, when it seemed there was mostly white dominance, when it seemed like it was the dominance of one culture over the others. And so they're saying, what is happening here? We got an African-American president? How in the world did that ever happen? Who is this guy? He's got a name that doesn't even sound like us. This is the suspicion that these Trump supporters have about Obama. They call him, and Trump is the one who started that birther thing, didn't he? About President Obama not being an American. That's so outrageous. But it's that kind of anger and ignorance that Trump has tapped into. I would just say we have to keep up our struggle as Bernie is doing. Bernie Sanders is taking the opposite approach. He's saying, I understand that you've lost your job. But it doesn't matter what color you are, because lots of people of different ethnicities have lost their jobs in America, not due to the illegal immigrants, not due to Muslims coming here, but instead, let's look at the issues that give rise to these problems, and let's unite together as human beings, as Americans together.